Sitaviana. You can call me Silvi. I am the 5th semester student majoring Information and Public Relations di Ponegoro University, Indonesia. But now I'm also participating in an exchange student at Asia University, Taiwan. At the talk show with the theme Youth References, Youth Perspective on Corruption, organized by the State Islamic University of Sunan Gunung Jati, Bandung, Indonesia, I will guide the talk show from start to finish. About corruption. Corruption is a common problem in many countries, in both developing and developed countries. We will always encounter acts of corruption. Many prevention efforts have been made to eradicate these crimes, starting from making of law and regulation, formation a special team to deal with corruption, but all of them have not been able to show maximum result. So, who should prevent corruption? Of course, of all us. Then, what is the perspective of youth regarding corruption? Here we will discuss with 3 speakers who are very outstanding today. For the first speaker is Jackelyn Carreon from Philippines. The second speaker is Mohammad Ruzain from Brunei, and the last speaker is Aneesa Nizam from Malaysia. Now I will greet speaker one by one. Hello, Jackelyn.
Hi, am I audible?
Are you there? How about your connection?
Oh, okay. Sorry, but am I audible?
Okay, Jackelyn. Maybe you can introduce briefly about your profile, time, and screen for you.
All right. So let me know if I'm audible, guys. Am I? Or I'm really not? Am I audible? Hi, am I audible?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. So, hi everyone. My name is Jackelyn Carreon. I'm from the Philippines and I'm currently taking up BA Political Science at the University of St. Lasal. And I'm actually co-chairing with some of the Model United Nations activities and conferences. And right now, I'm an aspiring lawyer and I'm really interested in discussing about pressing social issues. And with that, I would now further talk about myself. And yeah, you can ask me later if there's anything you want to know about me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jackelyn, for your profile. I think it's awesome profile. Okay, for the next speaker, the second speaker is Mohammad Ruzain from Brunei. Hello, Mohammad Ruzain. Are you there?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, of
Okay.
course.
So Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very good afternoon, I believe, to everyone. So my name is Mohammad Ruzain bin Ismail, but please call me Ruzain for short. I'm half Indonesian and half Bruneian, but I'm residing in Darussalam. So currently, I'm a third-year petroleum engineering student from Polytechnic Brunei, and I'll be interning next year. About myself again, just like Jackelyn, I'm also quite active in the Moon Circuit, especially focusing on Indonesian and Turkish-based MEN, mainly focusing on Human Rights Council, SOCOM, and UNHCR, and also Crisis Committee. And I'm quite thankful to be here, and hopefully later on we will have substantive discussion regarding the counterparts and mechanisms of corruption. So that's all for me. I'll pass back the floor to the MC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruzain. I think it's awesome profile too. And the last speaker is Aneesa Nizam from Malaysia. Hello, Aneesa.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, of course.
Hi, I'm Aneesa. I'm 19 years old and I'm currently reading a Bachelor of Law at one of the universities in Malaysia. Basically, a little bit about myself is that actually, I'm just like Ruzain and also Jackelyn. I've been in various MUNs and I've chaired and became the Secretariat Committee. At the same time, I'm also in one of the political party in Malaysia. Alongside with that, my interest is basically purely on political science and also reading the law. So yeah, that's a bit about myself. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anissa. That was a brief profile of speaker today, and I think it's a very amazing profile. Okay, uh, let's start the discussion. But first, let's look at the perspective of corruption from our speakers. Where the first speaker is Jackelyn from Philippines. Hello, Jackelyn. Jackelyn, are you there? Oh, I think Jackelyn has unstable connection. The next speaker is Mohammad Ruzain from Brunei. Are you there, Ruzain?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Okay, Ruzain, you can give your perspective of corruption
Okay.
now.
Okay,
Okay.
sure.
And time and screen for you.
Okay. So I'll start now. Okay, Sophie, if that's okay.
Okay.
Okay,
Okay,
sure.
Ruzain.
Okay, so once again, Assalamualaikum everyone. As per the topic today, which is about our perspective regarding corruption, I will integrate also some data as well, because perspective or opinions alone is not really a substantive stance to understand the matter at hand. So, corruption is quite prominent across the globe, and there's certain causes or consequences in various empirical situations. And before we start off with knowing the causes or what are the ramifications of corruption across the regions, we need to understand that corruption is not just about bribing money. It's also upon having two categories. So in corruption, there's two categories we need to actually outline, which is the upper level involving bureaucrats, presidents, ministers, and high government officials. And there is the lower level of corruption, which is more relative towards the civil servants as well. So those are the two categories of corruption we need to understand. Now, corruption happens to a lot of reasons, in my opinion, and it will affect certain categories. But before I proceed with that, I'll jump in briefly to the causes of corruption first. So these are the probable reasons, but it will vary across regions. Just a clarification. So number one is the size and structure of governments. Number two is the democracy and the type of political system. And number three is the quality of each institution. Further moving on is the economic freedom or the openness of the economy, or in other words, how transparent a government is. Uh, Number five is the press freedom and judiciary system, the cultural capacity, and the colonial heritage, or the last one could be the endowment of natural resources. So these are the main causes of corruption. But like I said earlier on, it varies upon different governments because um, each country has their own political system, which is the core focus, and also how big the population is or how big the working sector is, which consists of both government and a private-based sector, right? So that's the main causes. So the question here is, moving on, how is corruption measured? So there's not really an ideal way of measuring corruption, but the most effective method that I know is the CPI. I think that some people know CPI here, which is the Corruption Perception Index, which is published annually by the Transparency International organization. And this is basically, them interviewing business people or country experts on the perceived notion of corruption in the public sector, and it's measured from 0 to 100 as well. Um, so that's like for me a main indicator. Regarding my perspective, so that's the data that I've researched upon now. For my personal perspective, um, corruption is quite a challenge because the act of corruption themselves will have an effect on the subsistence or well-being of people, especially from the lower rankings, because usually majority of these corruption cases happen or involve high government officials. And another factor that could actually make it more challenging, or is a trial themselves, is the lack of data transparency or the lack of access to information to which it can only be accessed exclusively to these high government ranking people and not the civil servants or just the public like myself, right? So that's like for me a main challenge. And I do believe that in order to tackle this issue systematically, relevant government sectors, for instance, in Brunei Darussalam, the relevant ministries or the Anti-Corruption Bureau or the ACB or and also the NCB, the National Center Bureau must work alongside together to have a monitoring system or to actually adopt the UNCAC or the United Nations Conventions Against Corruption, which has been ratified by, if I remembered, 192 member states. So that convention themselves has a proper outline of what is needed to be done and what is the proper mechanisms to ensure that this will be handled in a very according manner. So I believe that the relevant state and non-state actors have such a significant role to ensure that they need to identify the possible situations of corruption in the respective departments and regions as well. So that's like my personal perspective. But talking about my country in Brunei Darussalam, it is quite a challenge because we don't have a lot of access to information in comparison with other countries, especially our neighboring countries like Malaysia or the Republic of Indonesia and Singapore as well, and the Philippines. We don't have that much access to information. And it's only, like I said earlier on, it's only accessible to these high government officials. I think that's a problem themselves. When there is lack of data transparency, we don't really know what's happening along the way. And when there's less knowledge, we have less information and less awareness of what might be happening around the departments as well in terms of the corruption cases. And I believe that for the country that I'm in, the government should actually be more forward and forefront to advocate to combat corruption because as per 2021, this year, our CPI score was actually 60. Now, Singapore's score is 86, if I'm not mistaken. If you can see that disparity of a gap of 26 marks, Singapore has a more larger working sector and Brunei has a less or a smaller working sector, and yet we are more corrupted than Singapore. And that, for me as a citizen, is quite concerning because when you're just under a monarchy system, it's not really that much of a conflict as opposed to certain countries that has a different political system, which might be conflicting towards one another. So Brunei being a small country, we are supposed to have less corruption. We're supposed to have a more tight, secure monitoring system. We need to adopt these UNCAC clauses, which we have ratified around, I think, to the 2000s or 1990s. So for me, as a citizen and as a student, I'm quite concerned about the corruption in Brunei Darussalam, simply because we just barely know what's going on. Not enough information is disseminated to the public. So that's actually like my area of concern. And I hope that one day, if I have, the opportunity to work or perhaps to be involved in projects regarding anti-corruption, we can really push further to reduce the involvement of personnels in corruption or bribery themselves in different areas and jurisdictions as well. So that's my perspective on corruption. Simply, I'll talk more later if I have the time. But for now, I think that's all. And I'll pass back the floor to the MC.
Okay, thank you so much, Ruzain, for your perspective. Any response for the Ruzain perspective, maybe? From Aneesa, how about you?
Hi, everyone. Okay. So in terms of corruption, I'm sure that corruption is a very big issue that we have to highlight on. And I'm sure that each and every single country, no matter if it's a low economic developed country or a highly economic developed country, I'm sure that any country would face the same problem. And so what is corruption? You go back to the root causes like what Ruzain would say. So corruption is basically already a form of dishonesty, and it's a criminal offense. It is basically practically undertaken by a person or an organization. Typically, if you would know, it's by the government itself. It is actually entrusted with a person with authority, and it's in order to acquire illicit benefits. Sometimes corruption can also lead to abuse of powers. But again, this goes back as to if the government would ensure that there is transparency in giving out information in between the government throughout the public. So again, corruption may be involved in a lot of activities, not necessarily within the government itself. It could be through many other different projects. Again, political corruption always happens, and it is normally by an office holder or other governmental employee acts. Typically, corruption is also they will also have it not necessarily for within the government's capacity, but also for personal capacity. And so corruption is basically like how you would label it among the kleptocrats. So in Malaysia itself, in 2013, when there was a public survey that was conducted to the public by the Transparency International, if we were to look at how would the public look at the government in terms of their transparency in giving out information to the public, a majority of the surveyed households perceive that a lot of the Malaysian political parties are highly corrupted. So a quarter of the survey households consider that the government's effort in the fight against corruption to be ineffective. So according to Transparency International, the Corruption Perception Index for Malaysia, we are ranked in the 57th place out of 180 countries. So this shows that it is not actually a good thing. And how would the youth take on corruption? Again, business executive survey in the WF or World Economic Forum and the Global Competitiveness Report, where it reveals that unethical behaviors of companies constitutes a disadvantage for doing a business in Malaysia. Why is that? It's because of the corruption that is happening all around the country. And again, government contracts itself, there's also corruption that happens. So again, sometimes government contracts are basically rewarded
perspective. Okay, let's start for the discussion. I have some questions for all the speaker here. Okay, let's start for the first question. How big is the role of youth, in your opinion, in helping eradicate corruption in the world? Okay, I will repeat. How big is the role of youth, in your opinion, in helping eradicate corruption in the world? For Ruzain, I get it.
Okay, so to make sure I'm hearing correctly, what is the role of youth? What is the role of youth's opinion to eradicate corruption? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Okay, so here's my answer. Hopefully this will be echoed to everyone else as well. I think that youth opinion is quite significant just because in the future, we'll be replacing these people in the both government and private sector as well. So it's not just our opinion that is important about the of the mechanisms or breakdowns of what corruption is, but also our character, our attributes. Because if we lack integrity in what we do, it will differ in our opinion, because an opinion might change, but our character is what defines us, is what defines what we will do in the future to actually replace these people someday at some point in life. So opinion is important, but like I said again, you need to have a proper character. You need to have integrity. You need to have honesty in what we do, because at some point in life, opinion changes, and you might sway from the corruption or the bribery we receive from people as well, based not just I think as Aneesa said, not just on the collective benefit of the government, but on our personal benefit as well, of what you might gain secretly, so that other people won't know. So opinions do matter, but it will change. Opinions will always change, but character, you need to be grounded properly with integrity, honesty, and compliance to the laws and jurisdictions of the country. So that's my answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruzain. And how about Aneesa? How about your opinion?
Sorry, can you repeat back your question?
Okay. How big is the role of youth, in your opinion, in helping eradicate corruption in the world?
Okay. How has basically youth played a role in eradicating corruption? I don't think there is a specific role that the youth can take over to eradicate or eliminate corruption in general. But in a sense that how would youth look at it precisely is that youth itself, when they look at the government, which is someone who is in higher in authority, to have corrupted the system, it will show that that it is not something that the youth should follow, and it would basically portray a really bad image to the public. As of Malaysia itself, corruption is a huge problem. As what I mentioned before, Malaysia had a corruption score of 51 out of 100. So in terms of the corruption score, obviously the higher of the score, it's lesser the corrupt in the government. And when Malaysia is more than half of one of the countries that are corrupted, it means that there are less transparency. And that what does the youth get? The youth is basically one of the people who basically has easier access in getting information, especially through social media. And when informations are not really conveyed properly, this means that there is no transparency, there is no clarity and certainty given out to us. So in Malaysia itself, Malaysia's key corruption is basically through the political and campaign funding. Whenever we have general elections, we have basically spent a donation of 700 million US dollars for campaigns and funding, which has shown a really, really ridiculous amount of numbers just for campaigning. And these monies are basically funded from both corporations and individuals to political parties and candidates who are not limited to Malaysians. Political parties are also not legally required to report on what funds are spent during election campaigns. This just shows, again, back to whether there is clarity and transparency given out to the public. This means that is the anti-corruption committee playing a good role in Malaysia to basically does check and balance on the ministers or government. In Malaysia itself, we have this thing called MACC, Malaysian Anti-Corruption Committee, where they basically check on the government, all the fundings that are basically done within, if it's actually corrupted or if it's actually using the taxpayers' money. As we all know, corruption is basically using the taxpayers' money, because government itself, they do not have any money funded among themselves. And so again, due in part of this political landscape, Malaysia's ruling party for over 55 years since our independence has basically shows that the funding is actually highly disproportionate to other parties. This shows that this is unfairly impacts campaigns in federal and state elections and can disrupt the overall functioning of a democratic political system. So when the government itself has enforced these kind of system, that means when the youth someday, when we, the new young generation, the Generation Z, will take over the country someday, will it be good? Will it be a good example for us to actually follow? Because these things are not something that we should look up to. As these things, corruption, it's very contagious, how I'd say this. When someone does it, the other person will follow. And so this is something that the youth should eradicate and eliminate when we know that corruption is basically from the taxpayers' money and it's funded purely on taxpayers. So how can we eradicate this? Of course, it goes back to awareness that the youth, whenever somebody they get to become the government, the money itself, or however they would fund the money in term to the each and every ministries in the government should be very transparent and very clear and transparent. So yeah, thank you. That's it.
Okay, thank you so much, Aneesa, for your opinion. For me, I think that youth is a successor of the country generation and will bring the progress to a country. So that the role is very important, I think, of course, especially to eradicating the corruption. Let's move to the second question. To all speakers here, okay, in your opinion, what kind of condition support the emergence of corruption itself? Okay, in your opinion, what kind of condition support the emergence of corruption itself?
Silvi, can you repeat it again? Because the audio is kind of breaking at some point. It's not really that clear. If you could just...
Sorry. Okay. I think this internet unstable. Okay, once again, in your opinion, what kind of condition support the emergence of corruption itself?
Okay, so in our opinion, what is the condition that supports the emergence of corruption? Is that the question?
Yes, of course.
The emergence of corruption, as in why corruption happens.
Sorry, can you repeat?
As in the emergence of corruption, also the meaning of why corruption happens. Is that the question?
Yes, of course.
Okay, right.
The factors. Okay.
Okay. So basically, in my opinion, it's I think I've also integrated this in my past speech earlier on. So why corruption happens is that, as also Aneesa stated earlier, it's both a collective benefit or a personal benefit, especially if an individual or a government officials know that if a system is not as strong as it seems, for instance, in Brunei Darussalam, it's easy to do corruption just on the basis that, how to say this, the higher ups are not working as much as the civil servants. And I know this not based on data because we don't have data on that, unfortunately, but this is based on stories that my relative or my friends have shared with me that has, especially my father who is working in the government sector as well. So that is quite a challenge because in Brunei Darussalam, one of the main cause of corruption is simply the huge gap of wage. Okay, so a high government official, for instance, a minister of a minister of a ministry in Brunei Darussalam, the wage per month is 40,000 Bruneian dollars. I think in Malaysia it will be 120,000 Malaysian ringgit. In Indonesia, I'm not really sure. I think it would be a lot. Simply, you can just have a math on that one later on. But it's quite high. That's the thing, and I have to say this based on what I've heard, simply because when you're starting to have that greedy intention as a person, then there's a lot of cases of accusations, and then innocent people might be affected. So I think that's one of the core reasons of corruption in the government sector. I'm not quite sure about the private sector in Brunei Darussalam, simply again because of data. But I can share a case that happened in. I can share just a case which is investigated by the ACB or the Anti-Corruption Bureau before the courts of Brunei, which happened between 2016 or 2018. So in 2017, the cases were quite high, to which it involves mainly the acceptor to obtain gratification or as an inducement or reward. So it's quite high in 2017, to which I believe there's a total of around 30 cases. Now, it might seem not a lot, but for a small country, it's quite high, simply because the money involved was quite high. That's the thing. So one of the reasons is simply because of your intention, your benefit. What can you gain from it, knowing that the system is not really as strong as it is, and there is not much adoption? Because here's the thing about Brunei Darussalam, there is not much awareness on corruption. In Brunei, we have to tread carefully of what the public can talk about, simply because the government does not allow certain topics to be discussed without a knowledgeable or a government officer which is relevant to the topic at hand. That's the thing. So we have to be careful of what we talk about. The second thing, um, why corruption could happen, is simply because, for instance, in Brunei Darussalam, I think it's because of, apologies, for the money, I believe. In Brunei, fuel is quite prominent, and the price of fuel is at maximum capacity. So that's one of the reasons why as well. Collectively, or conclusively, I would say it's more towards the monitoring system. Do we have a proper monitoring system at hand? Are we adopting the UNCAC properly? Are we complying to the national jurisdictions? But but on the flip side, it's ultimately depending on the government whether or not they are willing to help themselves, because the public cannot really do much. We have a lot of restrictions in Brunei Darussalam. Trust me, we have lack of freedom of what we can do as a public, because we mainly focus on volunteering, unfortunately, and youth activities, but not so much more towards, for instance, corruption or human rights. We're not allowed to touch upon that because of our ideology, which is a Malay Islam Baraja or Malay Islamic monarchy. So the ideology and the extent of freedom given by the government actually would allow how much corruption will happen in not just Brunei Darussalam, but in a country. So that's my answer to that question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruzain. How about you, Aneesa?
Okay. Again, in Malaysia itself, combating corruption has an increasing rising to the top of policy makers and company agendas. So how can we eradicate goes back to the previous question. It's again through our policies, and it's enforced by our policies. So despite the fact that it has been long a prevalent issue and that everyone is aware of corruption, there is a greater awareness of the negative implications of corruption on both socio-economic development. Malaysia has a history of implementing measures to tackle corruption and bribery, and with cases occurring for the past 4 decades and no indication of it slowing, there are many cases that revolves around the government. And if you were to look at it and if you were to Google about it, there are various and financial scandals that are going around the government. And it involves not just Malaysia, but actually other countries all around the globe. And so basically illustrate that how corruption and bribery are embedded within Malaysian political and government institution as such. Efforts made to be tackled, is it effective? And with the evidence suggesting that the increasing number of agencies which aim to do so are failing. So MACC, which is a committee to basically look for the check and balance, like what Ruzain would say, to what extent are they effective in checking and doing check and balance towards the governmental system to prevent any corruption. But however, the adoption of newly devised measures such as the introduction of corporate liability for corruption offenses are coming into effect in June, actually. And it could be a turning point for tackling corruption and bribery within Malaysia. However, there must be a lot of increased efforts which needs to be made to combat corruption, both nationally, regionally, and globally, due to the growing concern regarding its increasing incidence and negative implications. So as a result, extensive nature of corruption and bribery, the World Bank once identified it is one of the key barriers to socio-economic development. Corruption is regarded as a complex, multifaceted phenomenon, but it is nevertheless widely defined as the abuse of public power. So if you were to resonate the idea of corruption, automatically it will be the government. You would not have resonate the idea of corruption with any certain individual but the government itself. And so while it is a really big perception that shows that the government has basically abused their public power to use it for and they have basically violated the rules for private gains, there are also perception that is carried out primarily by government officials. And this issue can take place across a range of sectors and be executed by those other than government officials. So like public servant, for example, could also be one of the people that might also be involved in corruption. Again, forms of corruption which takes place including bribery, extortion, fraud, embezzlement, blackmail, illegal gambling could also be one of them. This just shows that public officials are taking or offering bribes, money, or services which is dishonest. And if you were to associate corruption, you would automatically associate it with criminal breach of trust, CBT. And these kind of things can lead to a criminal offense, and a person could actually be charged for a criminal offense in the judiciary, in the court. So when the public officials have basically been using the taxpayers' money dishonestly, it is basically subsequently has abused the trusted power given for the benefit of personal gain, and it is considered as a consequence of poor governance, and it basically has undermines the legitimacy of the state itself. So yeah, that's it for my answer. Over to the MC. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for all speakers here. So many factors behind corruption may be from social, economic, and other factors that can support the emergence of corruption. For the third speaker, for the third question, if, for example, you became a government official, what would you do to eradicate corruption? You heard mine first. If, for example, you became a government official, what would you do to eradicate corruption?
Okay. Okay, sure. So if I were to be a government official, here's the thing. It depends on what my level of authority is. If it's low, I can't do anything much. If it's high, I still need to discuss it pertaining to the technicalities of the Prime Minister's office, which is led by His Majesty the Sultan himself and certain royal family members. But let's say that I'm somewhat in the middle position. What I would do is to just propose effective solutions or monitoring systems, because the only measure that I know that Brunei is doing is simply just integrating the knowledge of integrity in primary education or secondary education, which is simply Melayu Islam Raja. So there's not much awareness programs or effective education at tertiary levels as well. We don't have that in Brunei Darussalam. It's simply just saying about your character attributes, because we learned that in MIB, or simply, I think in other words, it's called civic, civilized module. So that it's simply that. But if I were to be a government official, I need to take a stance to have that knowledge as well. If I have sufficient knowledge to counter any denial by certain government officials, that is quite important, because when you have clarity and understanding and just have a substantive comprehension in the issue of corruption, and you are, as an individual, able to counter any mis or disinformation by certain officials, which might be corrupted, I think that's enough to have a forefront to not just eradicate, but at best word to minimize the growth of corruption in Brunei Darussalam and other countries as well. But the issue here is that whether or not we have sufficient fundings for awareness, because in Brunei Darussalam we don't do taxes except for road taxes and business tax as well, which is already subsidized as it is. So it's up to the government, but we don't have that much funding because as per this year, I believe the World Economic Outlook of 2021, Brunei lacks the budget or the expenditure in certain areas. So I doubt there would be much fundings in raising awareness in corruption. Like I said, um, as a government official, it's a very thorough process in Brunei. You need to go to certain levels for your ideas or for your proposed programs to be accepted. If by any chance it violates or is against the statute or the ideology of Brunei, it will be rejected instantly, simply because it is a sensitive topic. Corruption is a sensitive topic in Brunei Darussalam. So that is a challenge themselves. So it is up to not just myself, hopefully my batch, the batch of youth that I'm in, we will we will just change the way the system is, because it does not require just one person. We need a lot of relevant people and authorities to actually change the way we think, the mindset that the government will work. So that's the best answer that I can give, just because in Brunei Darussalam there is a lot of restrictions, and even as a citizen you can't really do much. We can just only hope for more data to be disseminated, which at this point is quite impossible. So that's the best answer I can give, and I'll pass back the floor to the MC. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruzain. How about you, Aneesa?
Okay, so in terms of the youth, if the youth can play a major role in eliminating or eradicating corruption itself, of course, the youth doesn't really have much um, power or say in basically eradicating issues on corruption. This is because practically at this point in time, youth's voice, why is it always disregarded? It's because we're not somewhere that we can at this point in time, we are not the government, or we are not the members of parliament for us to voice out issues on corruption. However, in Malaysia itself, we have this one anti-corruption committee that puts an effort to receive a major boost in 2018, back when one of the opposition party has basically won during the general election in 2018. And when they came into power with the promise of a clean, accountable, and transparent regime that resonated well with the people following with financial scandals that are going around the country. So what happens is that there is this one committee that is called the NACP, the National Anti-Corruption Plan, which is formulated and launched, and it is currently overseeing its implementation. However, we should not purely just rely on the committee itself or the commission itself. We should also rely on policy making. Policy making, I thought it will be a very good, it's something that can actually eliminate the corruption that is happening nationally or regionally. I think in terms of the policy making, I think more youth will understand more about how the policy are made and how is it implemented. But in terms of Malaysia itself, the main enforcement agency continues to be the MACC, and the two together, NACP and MACC merged together, they are being the main anti-corruption bodies in the country. However, the NACP outlines the government strategies and measures around combating corruption, strengthening governance, integrity, and transparency in government operations. So throughout the 5 year, they have basically planned out 115 initiatives to combat corruption. And they have 6 strategic thrusts, which are strengthening political integrity, accountability, and effectiveness of public service delivery, efficiency and transparency in public procurement, so on and so forth. It is also important to note and highlight that the efficiency and transparency in enhancing the credibility of the legal and judicial system, as because judiciary itself is an independent and stringent institution that should stand on its own. So the NACP basically includes mandatory assets declaration for cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister's directive on the roles and responsibilities between ministers and secretaries general to improve the accountability framework of the administration itself. So some of the key initiatives that is initiated by MACC and ACP is that they would reform the efforts that are underway and in line with the objectives of the plan, but not necessarily limited to the NACP, which are listed as strengthening the parliament, which is the legislature, and the executive, and then asset declaration. So cabinet ministers has to declare all their assets to these two commissions to ensure that there is more clarity and transparency made to the public. and that also the Prime Minister's tenure also plays a big role in terms of combating corruption. And alongside with it, there's also procurement reforms. So I'll explain a bit about strengthening the parliament. So what MACC and the NACP does is that they reintroduced the Parliamentary Service Act 1963 to provide greater independence and autonomy to Parliament to ensure checks and balance on the functioning of the executive. So in terms of asset declaration itself, the NACP and the MACC, with whatever the cabinet ministers and the government basically declares to them, they will pass it on to the Parliament for to make it more transparent and clear. So for asset declaration is that the policy, there is a certain policy that is made for asset declaration is now in place for all executives and is being extended to the members of parliament MPs. And the asset declaration information has been established on all the MACC portal. And the next step is to ensure that it is extended to all the elected MPs. Next on is that the Prime Minister's tenure. Obviously,